G'day you mob, welcome to this episode of Aussie English, the number one place for anyone and everyone wanting to learn Australian English, as well as get their fair share of Australian culture, history, news and current affairs and all that jazz. So today I have a brilliant little interview with Adam Courtenay, a Sydney-based writer and journalist. Adam used to work as a financial journalist for papers such as the Financial Times, the Sydney Times, The Age, and the Australian Financial Review. But since then, in the last decade or so, he's been writing books on Australian history, including The Ship That Never Was, and his most recent release, and the subject of today's interview, The Ghost and the Bounty Hunter. Now, guys, this is an absolutely awesome book. I couldn't put it down. Adam sent me a copy of this a few days ago. I literally finished it within 2 or 3 days, which is, a pretty good record for me, as normally it takes me more than a week to finish a book. It's an amazing story about William Buckley, and he also covers John Batman and loads of other characters who were involved in the establishment of the colony in Victoria and the founding of Melbourne. But primarily, this book is focused on William Buckley, who spent 32 years as an escaped convict living amongst the Indigenous Australians in and around the area of Geelong. And these people were called the Wadawurrung people. So it's an absolutely fascinating read, guys. I really recommend that you get your hands on a copy. It's written incredibly well. You will love it. You'll get a fair dose of Australian history at the same time as learning a load about Indigenous history and culture as it was at the time of colonization. Anyway, guys, that was a big intro. Thanks again, Adam, for coming on the podcast. Kick the magpie, and let's get into it. G'day, guys. Welcome to this episode of Aussie English. Today I have author and journalist Adam Courtenay. Welcome, Adam.
Hello, how are you?
I'm good. So, mate, you just published a book, The Ghost and the Bounty Hunter, and you were kind enough to send me a copy, which I couldn't put down. It was absolutely wonderful. Can you tell me, I guess, first and foremost, a bit about your history? Where did you grow up, and what was your sort of childhood like? And did you always want to be a writer?
Look, I grew up in, you've got to know Sydney, I suppose, but in an area, and I still live in the area, but I've been back and forth, area around Watsons Bay, Vaucluse, which is the eastern suburbs of Sydney. And I grew up there to about the age of 18, 19, and then went to university and it's a beautiful area. It's very, very suburban. And I wanted to see the world at about 18, 19, 20. It was beautiful to live there, and it's right by the sea, and they've got some of the most beautiful harbour beaches around that part of Sydney. But I wanted to see the world. So pretty much after having left uni, I went overseas for about 18 years. And never really came back. I went to live in England, and I spent a lot of time in France and Italy. So I've been around. I speak a few languages. I've loved living overseas, but this is by the time I hit about the age of 40, I wanted to come back. And I'd always been a journalist. I was lucky enough to work for some of the bigger newspapers over in the UK, the Financial Times, the Sunday Times. I did a lot of work for countless magazines. So I've been a journalist and a writer for that. But it wasn't until about the age of 43, 44, 45, I just felt that I'd had enough of doing journalism. It's fine. I was a financial journalist, which I quite enjoy. But I wanted to do something else, and something in me clicked. My father's a well-known writer, but he didn't it clicked in myself. It wasn't related to, people say, oh, did you follow your father, Bryce? And I said, not particularly. He didn't actually, funnily enough, he didn't start writing till he was about 55.
Really?
So even older than I was. Yeah, no, he didn't start writing his Power of One till he was 50-something, 55, 54. Took him a couple of years to write it, and I think he was 57 or 8 when it actually came out. So his first book, he was quite long in the tooth, using expression. He was fairly long in the tooth, even longer than I am now. So at 45, I became very interested in, because I'd always been interested in travel. I wrote a book about the Amazon, and I went there a couple of times. I've done a lot of journeys in my life. I've walked over the Alps. I've been to the Kokoda track. I've done the Everest Base Camp. I've been to Annapurna. I've walked up Kilimanjaro. I love journeys, and I always wanted to write about journeys. And Amazon had thousands of these sort of little journeys to write about amazing conquistador feats into the jungle. And I thought, if I love that particular subject and great journeys, this is what I really should write about. And so that's where I kind of got started around about 11 years ago. I said, okay, this is the sort of thing I want to write about. I hope that gives you a short summary.
No, definitely. Yeah. I saw that book about the Amazon, and you won't know this, but my wife's Brazilian, and so
there you go.
Well, yeah, I've recently been getting into a lot of the Brilliant books. I've got them in a pile in my corner about the history there. With
Do you speak Portuguese?
Yeah, we only speak Portuguese in the house. So
brilliant. Okay.
Trying to raise my son speaking it
to be bilingual. Oh, good, that's great. I'm glad to hear it, because half my friends who are of some ethnic background don't speak the languages, and I always loved languages. And I speak French, Italian, and some German. I actually lived with Brazilians, and they told me I could speak a little bit of Portuguese, but all I seem to remember is the swear words for some reason. So I can swear really well in Portuguese, but that's not going to help me in Rio de Janeiro. But I went to Manaus when I was there.
Yeah.
And I could understand a lot because I'd lived with Brazilians, but I wasn't great at speaking, to be honest. But I got around. I kind of got around, and it's similarities with Italian and so it was. Brazil is close to my heart in some ways.
So that was the first sort of step in getting sucked into history and writing sort of history books, was it? The Amazon stuff?
Well, see, I thought to myself, I'm tired of reading. I looked at what is there in Australian history, and I was also, because I'd lived in England, I looked at the English history, and it's always the same stuff. World War II this, Churchill that, Henry VIII this, but in Australia, same thing. Burke and Wills, Eureka Stockade. I won't mention a certain writer who seems to be very good at promulgating all the excellent cliches.
I think I have his most recent book, right, by Cook, or about Cook.
Look, he tends to go for the obvious, but we won't use this time to talk about that.
Mm-hmm.
The point I'm trying to make is, I wanted to find something different that someone hadn't wrote about, neither in Britain, more much in America, or obviously in Australia. And I was just fascinated by the Amazon, because it is made up of, when it comes to journeys and adventures and great expeditions, incredible expeditions that nobody's ever heard of. And they're all mostly done, not all, but many of them are done by Europeans, many of the same kinds of people who went into Africa. Now, if you wanted to look at great journeys, you go into England and you hear only about great journeys into Africa. There's very little on South America. So South America, to me, is the continent that we as quote unquote Europeans, or whatever you want to call it, Europeans, Westerners is probably the better way, have neglected. But at the same time, Peter, is that you can't sell a book because no one's done it. It's very, very hard to sell this book. So I had something like 80 rejections now. And I finally got it published in 2015, if I remember correctly. I didn't get paid anything. I just wanted to get published so that it was in a book and in an ebook form. And it hasn't done particularly well, because still no one's interested in South America, really. It's just an unknown. It really is the unknown story in terms of journeys and expeditions.
I was pulling my hair out trying to find stories, because I got sucked in by Tim Flannery's The Explorers, where he used snippets of 30 or so different explorers' diaries and put that into a book. And I was like, far out. Like, I got so sucked in, and I'm like, my wife's Brazilian. I would love to know. There must be shitloads of people who went exploring in Brazil, in South America, in these countries. And yet I couldn't find...
get a copy of Amazon Men and it's all there.
Exactly. That's it. I came across your book.
A fair bit of it.
It seemed very hard to find, the journals of these people published in English. It seemed like there was effectively nothing.
Well, look, it's obvious, We only look at, this is what sort of has frustrated me in many ways. We only look at the history that concerns ourselves.
Yeah.
Now, I'm sure that the Brazilians and Argentines and they have their own histories and they publish their own histories. But I always wanted us to know more about, the Amazon is the most incredible place on earth.
Mm-hmm.
How on earth did people get in there and what happened? What happened to these people? What strange things? I just found it fascinating, but the rest of the world still doesn't seem to have come with me. So that's life, you know. You try to write a book, and that's
do you
just the
think
way things go.
Is that tied into our education when we begin our sort of, formative years at school, and that history is quite often
absolutely
taught old school,
English,
right? Rome,
English. We English learn about the English, and then again, of course, there is a Western canon, I think they call it, where we learn about parts of the French history, German perhaps, but mostly Roman, etc., medieval. It's all been done in a particular way that I don't think gives us a really good sense of history around the world. The world was one, it's always been dependent on each other. We say, oh, it's a global world. It's been global for 500 years as far as I'm concerned. And everything about what I wrote, and even in the conquistadors back in the 1400s, 1500s, it's a global world. And everything that impinged on Brazil at that time came from another source. So yes, we tend to stick to our own histories. That's why Australian history is always going to do a lot better here. It's obvious. We want to know about our own history.
Yep.
But I guess I'm surprised at how little we want to know about everybody else's. That's what I'm really saying.
Yeah, it is. It is weird too when you have the internet and, access to this information like never before, you would imagine. It's almost like people are overwhelmed with information, and you get that paralysis by analysis. You don't know where to start, so you just kind of give up, right? It seems like people are just bombarded with this stuff. What was history like at school for you? Were there...
look, you're gonna laugh at this, because I actually left in year 10. I finished doing history in year 10. I always loved it. I just didn't. I think I just became bored by the way it was taught. I'm sure you're a generation younger than me, but I think it still holds true that in year 9 we all do Australian history.
Yeah.
And I just bored the living hell out of me, to be honest. And
yeah.
I think the stuff we did a lot of European history before that I found fascinating, but Australian history isn't well taught, and I don't think it's well documented, and it needs to be drilled down to in a way that I think it's only just happening now, and I think Australian history is beginning to become a real thing that people say, well, we've got to learn more about. Graziers started coming here in 1820s or whatever it was. I mean, the history of Victoria, which is what this book is about, which you've just read, it is at the very beginnings.
Yeah.
This is an interesting question for you. I don't know how much Victorians, because New South Welshmen like me would know nothing about the founding of Victoria, and I didn't know anything before I wrote this. Is it well known in Victoria what I wrote about? That's the question. Now, isn't that say everything about our historical knowledge?
Yeah. It was sad. I remember we learned a lot about, I think, Cook, maybe a little bit about the First Fleet when I was in year 9. But again, Cook, I really like him as a character and what he did in our history. But he sort of just arrived here. It wasn't really that much in terms of the development of Australian history and our nation. He touched on here for a few months and then buggered off and never came back. So I don't know why that's so emphasized.
I guess he was the first to put the flag down and said, this is... Well, he didn't say it's Australia, but it's New Holland. He did them. I mean, he's the one who said it'll be here.
Yep.
And I think that was it. I mean, just out of interest, I don't think virtually nobody in New South Wales knows who John Batman is.
Yeah.
Now,
well, no one knows that Melbourne was going to be called Batmania, right?
Well, I think even John Batman, he probably would have realised that was going a bit too far. Batmania never stuck. But I'm sure that local Victorians know Faulkner and Batman. I mean, they probably know that, I'm guessing.
Well, it's messed up.
We haven't got a clue. We don't know anything.
Even through your book, I'm like, holy crap, these are all the street names in Melbourne. Like, I know these names, but I don't know the characters. There's Burke, there's Collins, there's Swanston, there's all of these different names. And you're like, holy crap, I finally get... But how do I not... I'm 32, 33, and I lived in Melbourne for 10 years.
That's exactly classic example of how our history has failed us.
Yeah.
Why don't we look at Melbourne or Sydney? Sydney's just as, here's another example. I'm everywhere in Sydney, and I'm not so sure, I doubt it probably went down your way. Everywhere in Sydney is Macquarie Place, Macquarie this, Macquarie that. Yeah. I'm now reading the biography of Macquarie, and now I know who he is. But I knew he was governor. That was about it. Yeah. Now I know exactly. Why isn't history taught so that we know why this street was there, and then you can put history into a oh yes, I work on Swanston Street or whatever. Now I know why they named it after that. And that gives history an immediacy and an understanding.
Do you think that's a big problem though with why we have so many people demonizing our history at the moment and these characters in the past and wanting to tear down statues? Is it that we've forgotten the stories because they haven't been taught?
I find this one a very tough one because I don't want to see this history of Melbourne, and I just learned it all myself writing this book. I don't. It's a history whether we like it or not, and I don't like this. Yep. I mean, if you look, I think I say it in the book. If you look at the Batman Memorial, I think it's somewhere in the middle of Melbourne. It's got three different little. I'm pretty sure it's three little. The first one, the second one crosses out the first, and the third crosses out the second. And
these are plaques at Queen's Vic Market, I think, right, that have been put up and then corrected and
then corrected. Where is it? Queen's Market, is it? Queen's Market.
I think it's Queen's Market. Yeah, the Victoria Market in North Melbourne.
Yeah. See, I don't know. It's funny, I've written about it, but I don't know Melbourne as well as I should. But I really don't. I've learned a bit about, but I really should go there and make sure I know more. But anyway, Queen's Market, exactly. That's a classic example. People defacing Cook. I believe that every culture has a right. If they want to put a statue of Cook, then let's put one of an Aboriginal guy up there as well, next to him, and say these two are equivalent. This is the person that was in charge. It could have been Bennelong here in Sydney. Let's put Bennelong up there with Cook, and if you want to change it, at least put Bennelong, the man that was there with Cook, whose nation Cook took. I don't mind that. Don't destroy one for the other, because you can't change history, terrible as it is.
Well, it's almost like burying family secrets too, right? It's kind of like, well, that doesn't really help. You can't learn from history if you hide all of the stuff you didn't like.
I mean, Batman, I believe the electric down your way has been taken away and it's been replaced by another name. I don't have a big problem with that. It's the memorials when they keep changing things, because society changes its views on things, then these things somehow become. It should have been kept. I mean, they have kept. Let's be honest. They've replaced the plaque. They've kept the original there. They haven't defaced it. So we can see how society. In a way, it's very interesting. You can see how society has changed its views over the period. Look, it's a very difficult one, because having read having written this book, I was just in awe of the Aboriginal people, what they had to go through.
Yeah.
It was very, very, very sad writing it in many ways. I think what happened to Victoria is every bit as bad as what happened in Tasmania, which gets a bigger press.
Yep. Let's get on to it then. So you wrote this.
Of course, we haven't even talked about the book.
That's it. I'm sorry, I'm getting onto it. You've just written The Ghost and the Bounty Hunter. So how did you find out about the story then? If you grew up in Sydney and you'd never heard of Batman or Buckley, or at least didn't know much about them, what's the story?
Following on from the theme that I kind of said to you before, is that I don't want to do Cook. I don't want to do all the big ones that have got their name. So I'm looking for stories that often have a big local understanding, like Geelong knows about Buckley, for instance. Geelong and parts of Melbourne, they all know about Buckley, but the rest of Australia doesn't. And now this is an incredible story about a man who embedded, for want of a better word, himself into Aboriginal ways. And it had not the story had. First, it was suggested to me, and he said, this expression, "You've got Buckley's, mate." I said, "Oh yeah, what's this?" Is when I didn't know anything, and I thought, "Who's Buckley's?" And I got a Victorian view, was it came from Buckley's and Nunn, the department store, and others said, "No, it's from William Buckley." And I actually went and asked. I was thinking of doing Buckley's at one point, and I asked an audience in Mornington Peninsula, "Is it Buckley's and Nunn or William Buckley?" And 50% said it was William Buckley. The other 50% was Buckley. So nobody quite knows, but. The answer to the question is, I'm looking for stories. The one I did before this, The Ship That Never Was, a very Tasmanian story. And I think it had a great deal to say about the convict system, even though it wasn't related to Sydney and its convicts. It had a great deal to say about how convicts were treated. I have to find something that has a social and historical element to it. Now, Buckley is, if you look at it straight, it's just a story about a guy who lived with Aborigines, but it's as you could see, it's much, much, much more than that.
Yeah.
It's about how white man how white men and black men can work together to some extent and be together, but how that can be destroyed. And it's about our relationships with Aborigines at the very earliest stage. And I needed something. I can't write just about a pure journey or a pure adventure. It has to have a social and historical element to it. Buckley's fitted that bill in every single way because it was about white Aboriginal relations as much as it was about the life and times of William Buckley. So it fitted that bill. Now, what I want is another story that's a local story. It could be a Queensland one. Maybe even I might even find one in Sydney that hasn't been told, that has that greater sense about it of it being important to our history. At the same time, it's a cracking good read and it's a cracking good story. Buckley fitted that bill. So did Jimmy Porter in The Ship That Never Was, the one I did before that. And they're not well known to the rest of Australia, and that's really important. It's got to be smaller things, but have an import for the rest of Australia. And I think both of those fit that bill.
Yeah. Oh, man, there's so many questions that I wanted to ask. But before we get into it, can you tell me, so you've got three sort of protagonists in this book. You've got John Batman, who was a currency lad, which I'll let you explain. You've got John Faulkner, who was a convict that came out to Australia. And you've got Buckley, who was also a convict that came out, but then ended up living with the Indigenous people for 32 years. Can you give us a sort of nutshell review of each of these characters?
Oh, look, John Batman is I'm just trying to think. I think he's the only Indigenous Australian. So he was born in Parramatta.
Yep.
Which I think makes him a currency lad. Is that the reason? I'm not sure.
Yeah. So he was the first generation. Yeah.
He was the first generation, very much. Born in 1800, if I remember correct. And he's a true Australian in that sense. And I think the interesting thing about him is that he had a lot of great ambition, and he came to Tasmania at pretty much the same moment that many other pastoralists were coming out from the UK. But here's a guy who was 20, 21 or something around that time when he came out and knew Australia like the back of his hand. The rest of the pastoralists, he had a backwards knowledge, and he lived and talked and probably spoke some of the Parramatta the languages of people who lived in Parramatta. He had Aboriginal friends growing up as a kid. He came to Tasmania and it wasn't foreign, whereas for all the other pastoralists it was. And that made him very different from the start. It meant that he was not ill at ease in his surroundings and was able to feel more at home and could converse with the local people. So that's John Batman. William Buckley was a illiterate bricklayer. He lived in a little tiny village called in Marton in Cheshire. Left home at an early age and went to live with his grandfather, I think it was, and was apprenticed to become a bricklayer at 14 or 15. He was a giant of a man. Already at 15, he was over 6 foot. I mean, he was unbelievably huge for his time. He'd be a huge guy now. In those days, he was gargantuan. I mean, in the sense that if you were 5'7" or 8 in those days, you were considered a tall guy.
Well, that's the joke about Napoleon, right? That he was 5'7" or something, and everyone's like, "Oh, he was tiny." It's like, no, everyone was that height at that time.
Everybody was that height. Yeah, exactly. I thought he was actually about 5'4". So, but I'm not sure how tall Napoleon. But anyway, Buckley was enormous and built and big. Now, not just he was extremely well built, and he became a pivot man. He went from being a bricklayer. He said, "I've had enough of this drudgery. I'll join the militia groups," and they were going out to Holland in fighting against the French in the late 1890s. He got wounded, but apparently acquitted himself very well. And it's said that he came back to England, fell in with the wrong crowd, was accused of stealing some Irish cloth, which is Irish cloth at that time was extremely valuable, and sent down to the colonies. So the guy never really had a chance to be himself. He was working as an apprentice. He was in the army, and then he was a convict. So he was always somebody else's plaything, if you like.
And this was by the age of 21, right?
And by the age of 21, 20. So when he finally got down to Victoria, when they first settled in 1803, it was a failed settlement. He said, I think this is the guy who said, "Here's the most beautiful place I've ever seen. It looked like England unalloyed. It was perfect. I'm going to take my chances. I'm going to go out there and take my chance." And so he did. and he fled with 5 other guys. The rest either didn't make it or went back. He stayed on, and there he was in the Victorian bush. The only white men were the odd whalers and sealers that might come ashore and kill seals and destroy whales. He was on his own. And
this was amazing. Sorry to interrupt you, but to give you quickly, the 1803, I think it was, he landed in Sorrento or near there, and they set up their base. He escaped, and you just kept mentioning in the book these names of towns and places that I've been to my whole life. You know, you were talking about him going all the way around Port Phillip Bay to Indented Head to Point Lonsdale, Ocean Grove, Barwon Heads, Torquay, and I'm just like, again, how do more people not know this? But yeah, it's an incredible tale of him running away from.
It's funny. I think it must be. I wondered to myself, not being a local Melbourne guy and only knowing most of these places by name, and I did go around. I did go around the Bellarine Peninsula and Corio Bay. And I mean, I've seen the basics. I've been to Geelong and I went to Buckley's Falls. I've missed quite a bit, so I haven't seen everything. And I've only been through parts of the Mornington Peninsula, and I checked out Sorrento, but only very vaguely. I didn't really have much time when I was doing it. But I was wondering if Victorians reading this would say, "Oh, I didn't realise it was like." I was hoping that when they read it, "Oh my God, I didn't know it was like that in those days." Because I'm just going on the description of the place.
100%. I didn't know Buckley was really. Well, I didn't know he was so spread around in Victoria. I thought that Point Lonsdale, you know, Buckley's Cave, that's where he landed. That's where, you know, it's near here that he came in contact with Batman. That's it. But your book shows, you know, how far afield he went throughout the entire state.
Yeah, no, he lived around Port Phillip Bay and inland too. He probably went as far in, easily as far in as Ballarat, because the Wadawurrung people went that far inland, and to other places, you know, the further down south. Yeah, I mean, he was the Port Phillip Bay man, really, the first guy to really go around the whole thing and see it. I mean, he's almost, you could almost say he was a kind of expeditioner himself.
And so what about John Faulkner? How does he fit into this?
I put him in as a lesser character. Others have put him as a higher character. I didn't. Maybe that's because I just didn't like him from the start. I really didn't. I admire him in some ways. I admire Faulkner. I think he wanted to take credit for something that he shouldn't really take credit for. Yes, he was one of the pioneers. Of course, he was one of the pioneers of Victoria. But Batman was the guy who went out there, did the treaty. That's another whole other story. Faulkner just said, "Oh, okay, I see you've done that. They're expecting somebody to come. I'm going." Faulkner's the way, and then Faulkner gave nothing away. He didn't help. He didn't give anything to anybody. He said, "I'm just going to use this place." He's the archetypal settler, in my opinion. He did have some very good relationships with some of the local people, so it's not entirely true. But you always got the impression with him, he's doing it for his own gain. Batman, interestingly enough, well, we'll get to that perhaps later. But Faulkner, I don't like the way he talked about Buckley. He was hypocritical about it. First, he'd tell people that Buckley was some sinister mastermind who was going to raise all the local people to come up against the settlers. And in another breath, he'd say that Buckley was a lump of lard and he didn't have a brain and he was just savage, half savage or whatever. So the question is, John Faulkner, what was he, a criminal mastermind, or was he? He'd say anything he liked. And Faulkner was a very persuasive man. He had a lot of sway in what he said. People believed. He's just one of these highly opinionated people who spreads bad news if it suits him. And that's why I try to give as little to him as possible, because I don't think he gave very much to the colony at all in those early days.
He was an opportunist, right?
He was an opportunist. I admire him. He went out there and he did it hard, like many of the guys. You can't but not admire him. But at the same time, what's his lasting legacy? You know, I don't see much there. For Faulkner, so yeah, that's my feelings about him.
Well, let's focus.
I love Buckley, and I don't like the way he treated him.
Well, let's focus back on Buckley's story. So Buckley ran away from this settlement that then later failed, and they ditched it, right? So Collins had tried to set up a settlement, their military outpost, right, to keep the French away.
Yeah, I don't know if you could call it a military outpost, but yes, he kept it. He situated it at a point which would have given military advantage, because if the French came to that part of the world, he would have seen them and been able to attack. So I believe, and it's just my conjecture, that he selected Sorrento because it was close to the ingress and outgress of the bay. It was advantageous. There weren't too many rips and currents and swells and all that sort of thing. It was protected. It probably was a good place in terms of it being a harbour for ships, but it wasn't a very good place in terms of being for colonisation. There were much better places. And of course, Batman later, 30 years later, selected a far better place, which was, of course, Melbourne. It was a much better place than anything Collins had ever found. And Collins knew about Melbourne, by the way. It'd been seen, and he never really ventured up there and checked it out. And there are places on the Bellarine Peninsula, Geelong, Corea, were much better than that he could have gone, and there would have been better places to settle. But Collins just decided, well, I don't really like it here for whatever reason, and said, we're going. And that was it.
Well, I love his Buckley's escape too, right? I think you were saying that it was either New Year's or Christmas. He waited for
just after Christmas, yeah.
Yeah, can you tell us that story then?
Look, the story was, I think, it goes that everybody was a bit down at heart, so they doubled the rations of grog and the people were partying on, and probably the soldiers were having a bit more grog than they would normally have. So Buckley and his unruly motley crew, so to speak, decided, this is a beautiful time because they'll all be drunk. But of course they weren't, and they were shot at, and one guy was hit, I believe. One guy was hit while they left, but the five of them, one guy was hit. Another guy stayed with that guy, and there was four of them. One dropped out, and three made it along all the way to Mud Island, and then So Buckley had two guys with him for most of it, but then they went back. So that was the story there.
So why did Buckley decide, you know what, I'm not going back, screw this, you're on your own? Because I can imagine that's like us entering space alone, right, at that time, where the understanding of the locals was that they were savage cannibals. What do you think was going through his head at the time and made him decide, you know what, screw it, I'll take my chances?
First, he was extremely big. He was strong. Now, that doesn't make you more capable or able of survival, but he probably believed this is a guy that had pretty much had to fend for himself since the age of 15. He'd been in the army. He'd been highly respected. He knew he was able to make decisions for himself. And he, as I sort of said, he had a life of drudgery in the army. He had a life of drudgery as a convict and as a bricklayer. He just didn't want to go back to that life. He'd had enough. And he said, I think he said, it's liberty or it's death. And if I don't make it, then at least I had my chance of liberty. It's the first time he'd ever been free in his life, really. Yeah. Other than when he was probably a kid, but then he was under his mother's orders. I think there was a part of him was relishing this freedom. Another part of him was damn scared because he didn't know. But he had the guts to go through it. And he thought, I could forage. I'll find myself a fire stick. He was very lucky in the sense that he's in one of the most fertile parts of Australia at that time. There were berries to eat. There were seashells to be found. There was abalone. He reckons he could find the gum from this tree that was edible, and he found out later that it was. He probably made a few mistakes, but he scavenged an existence. He ate pig face, which he said was like watermelon.
I tried that the other day. That exact species he would have grows in my mum's front yard because she.
Yeah, I think I've got a bit. I haven't tried eating it yet, but I will.
It's salty.
But good water. So it's a good water supply, I think. Yep. And I think it grew in proliferation in one part in Nuraki where he stayed. I don't know if he was able to fish. He couldn't get eels, but he could get he'd get oysters and things like that. So he somehow scrambled to get an existence, and he made it. He wasn't, but once he was on the move and things became wintry, all the food sources started to dry up, and he didn't know how to look after himself then, and that's when things got very critical for him. And
so what exactly happened? Because it's a really interesting story of how he encountered Indigenous people and how they accepted him, right?
Well, there were two encounters, one brief, I can tell you that one, or the one where he actually met the people he would live with. Which would you prefer me to?
Go with the people, the second one.
Yeah. Well, he did meet some, but decided not to stay with them, even though they asked him to. But basically, he was wandering back. I think he had decided, he says in the book that, in the Morgan book, that he decided he wanted to go back. He just couldn't couldn't stand the winter anymore. There was no food, and he wanted to go back to the camp. So he's on his way back to the camp. He's getting very sick. He had absolutely no power left in his limbs. He got all the way to Thompson's Creek, which is in Brimley, I think, and he forded the stream there. And at that point, just before that happened, he'd found the grave of a warrior. And in that grave, there was a mound in the earth. He found a very large spear. And he took the spear thinking, well, it might help him to walk, or who knows, he might be able to hunt it. So he basically desecrated a grave, but he said, look, I had to. I just think I had to use this. I was starving. He forded the creek, but after that, pretty much his reserves of strength had gone. And he fell down and went unconscious. Now, I think he was being tracked by the local people. They knew he was there. And they were just curious, who was this person? And then when he woke up, there was three Aboriginal women around him, screaming and wailing and saying, this is him. They saw the spear and believed he was a returned kin, i.e. someone who had died and been resurrected. And they called him Murungurk, which appears to be the name of the person whose grave he took the spear from, and they thought he'd come back to them. Now, you've got to go into some of the Aboriginal beliefs at this time, which is many of them believed that when you died, you went over the seas, your spirit went over the seas to Tasmania, and some of you came back. Now, they don't believe that anyone they believe that they don't believe that there's anything other than their own knowledge. So if you've come back, that means you must have been kin in the first place. You've returned to a place where you were when you were living. So they saw the spear. The man may have been, who knows, Murungurk may have been a tall guy. They might have thought, this is him coming back as a white ghost, so to speak. He's back, he's resurrected. You are Murungurk. And they believed wholeheartedly for the rest of his 32 years over there that he was Murungurk come back. And they treated him with unbelievable honour. It's almost like, imagine seeing one of your own dead relations coming back. It's the greatest thing that could ever happen to you, to see your mum or dad come back, or your cousin, or your husband, or wife, or whatever. And he lived as returned kin, and they treated him like with kid gloves, so to speak. And they loved him, and that was it. Buckley was in. He was really in.
What do you think it was like for him experiencing that kind of acceptance and love from people that I would imagine he'd never experienced before?
I think that he'd never had such love and affection from anybody, including his family. I think the first few days he was just in total, he just had no idea what was going on.
Yeah.
He always thought every time they lit a fire, they were going to throw him on the fire and cannibalize him. Thought that, and so he was in this state of not quite sure what was going on, until they did a corroboree for him, and it was then very clear to him that he was a guest of honor. Even though, of course, they were treating him really well, they were giving him food, they were looking after him. He says something like, "Oh, I only went off to, I think, maybe for a toilet break somewhere, and they couldn't find him, and they started getting really upset." Because they wanted him around all the time. They wanted to treat him as this great sort of returned person. And then they had a magnificent corroboree for him, which I tried my best to describe in the book.
And a corroboree is like a celebration, a party, right, with dancing.
He realised with dancing and people beating the drums, there was what he called an orchestra player. There were men dancing right in front of him. There were women dancing around him in the nude. He said, he couldn't quite believe what was going on. They had all their ornamental gear, some of it quite frightening. They were in the dark with a fire behind them, and they all had the white lines down their body. It would have looked pretty scary, but he began to realise that this was he's pretty sure it was in his honour. This is saying, welcome back, and this is our way of celebrating it. And he said, that was the first night I slept beautifully, because then he realised he was in no danger, and never mentioned after that he was in any danger. He felt to be in any danger with his new family, so to speak.
And he ended up occupying a very interesting role in Indigenous relations, didn't he, as a result of being this returned person from the dead?
Yeah. Well, of course, let's remember that when he came out in from the cold, so to speak, 32 years later, he was absolutely conversant with all the Kulin languages, because if he spoke Wadawurrung, he was intelligible to people like the Boonwurrung and to the Woiwurrung. In fact, just about all the Port Phillip Bay tribes understood. They understood each other. They probably had basically different dialects of the same language. It's like, so he could be understood throughout the Port Phillip Bay area and beyond as well.
And he'd forgotten English by this point too, right?
It could totally forgotten English. So he walked into this camp set up by Batman. Batman wasn't there. It's important to know that Batman had gone back to Tasmania but left 8 people, 5 of his Aboriginal men and 3 white guys. And Buckley comes in, this huge man, sort of walking out of the primeval slime or primeval bush, whatever you want to call it, and was an astonishing figure, all dressed in possum skins, knew how to use his spears, had the stance of an Aboriginal guy, couldn't speak the English, just sat there, looked askance, and said nothing.
What do you think the Westerners thought? You know, because they would have had no idea, right?
Well, if you see what I did was I purposely made it from the point of view of one of the Aboriginal guys, because the Westerners wouldn't have had a clue. But the Aboriginal guy would have realised that this guy had been embedded for many, many, many years. Not only was he embedded, he was an important man. He could tell that Buckley was not just a guy who went to live in that. He's actually an important man, and he understood that this is an important man come to see what they were all about, and that's important to know that, I think. So yes, in answer to your question, he began to understand English again. It came back to him over the next few weeks, so he could converse with them. And of course, the Wadawurrung didn't know why these people were on their land. But if they were to be on their land, they had to give some kind of gift. There was a gift giving. They had to give there had to be some reciprocity. And so Buckley was there they would have probably annihilated these 8 people if it wasn't for Buckley. It's almost certain. Yeah. They would have said, these guys aren't giving us enough. They haven't done all the right protocols. They haven't asked to be on our land. Why should we even entertain them being on our land? And he sort of soothed the way between the two. And that's where
it broke up there. It broke up there for a sec. Sorry, what did you say about Buckley?
I was just saying that they realised he was there Buckley was there to smooth the way between the two different races, and he would become then the famous go-between for both. So when information needed to be exchanged, it was Buckley that was always the man that they used to do so.
Well, it was amazing with the Indigenous people, the Kulin people and Wadawurrung that he was with. He was never expected to fight, right? And he became a bit of a peacemaker between quarrels, and quite often made it his goal to try and stop bloodshed between Indigenous people too, before they even...
I think that he saw this. They realised he wouldn't be in a fight, or they wouldn't let him be in a fight, because, as I understand it, they thought he'd already had enough. He'd already experienced enough having had to die, so we don't want him to die again. Yeah. And
he'll come back even wider.
He might even, he might be transparent by that time. But so they treated him with kid gloves, but at the same time he says in his journal, and this is one thing I find a little difficult. It seemed to be in the Morgan journal, because Buckley couldn't write; he was illiterate. So he got John Morgan to write the story for him. But in the journal, he seems to be saying that there were fights every 5 minutes, and there weren't. I just don't believe it. It's one of the things I think that was just used. I think there were obviously going to be problems between clans and then between different tribes, and women seemed to be the big reason for it. So I think he did do a lot of smoothing over, trying to be the great conciliator. And I think that was his role, and he became respected for it. That we can work things out. He helped to work things out, which is surprising in a way, because it would have taken him many years to understand the culture that he was dealing with. And I think to be a conciliator, you really have to be on top of the culture. Yeah. You really have to know who's in the right here, and for what reason. Because the Aborigines' kinship was an important thing, but it also there was a very strong feeling of everybody knowing their place. Everybody knew who each person was, and where they should be, what they should be doing. Everybody had an identifiable role, and Buckley would have had to understand that. Everybody's role, to be able to negotiate between various warring factions.
Yep.
who's had the right here and who has the right there. And unfortunately, we don't get many. He says he was a conciliator, but we don't get too many episodes that I can remember in the Morgan of him telling us how he, smoothed things over. So there's not much. There isn't a great deal of evidence that he was a great conciliator. He says he was, and one gets the impression that he probably was, but there was no evidence of it.
Well, I found throughout the book too that you obviously refer to him as a bit of a ghost, but he kind of has that he ends up in a kind of ghostly position in the Indigenous tribes later on, right? Because of some quite tragic events that happened to his family. Can you talk about that?
Yes, if I remember correctly, this episode, you have to understand a bit of the culture here. What happened was there was a man, I think he'd come into their tribe, bitten by a snake, and within a few hours had died. Now, as I understand it, the Aborigines didn't believe in that the same kind of cause and effect, i.e. that a snake bit the man and killed him. And there's another, this is what Buckley sort of says. There's another example that I found in the literature where a man was bitten by a snake and he said it wasn't the snake, it was a man from another tribe who directed the snake towards me. There's even another example of a man spearing another man, and the man says the spear was not directed by the man who threw the spear, it was from another tribe. Now, they believed a little bit like we did that foreigners, serious foreigners, people from a very far off tribe were all cannibals. They were all bad people. And they would always put the blame on what they called bad magic from a distant tribe. Didn't come from one that you knew. A local tribe a local tribe that you knew would not do a bad thing to you. It was always one from. So what would happen is a man could, in this situation, a man lost his life through a snake. This man's tribe believed that because Buckley's adopted nephew was with the man the night before, that it was actually his fault. Yeah. So they came and enacted vengeance on on Buckley's brother-in-law, if I remember correctly, and one of the sons, because they believed that they had put the bad magic on him. Not that the snake had done anything. The snake was just the end result. Yeah. And that's one of the beliefs that Buckley had a lot of problem understanding. He would have just said, the snake got him, that's just the way it is. They never saw it quite that way. There was always a reason.
They blamed sorcery, right, or other people.
Other people, sorcery. Anyone further away was a sorcerer. So the unknown was also a bad thing.
The thing about that situation that blows my mind too is that I think you mentioned it's on the Barwon River, this tribe of 60 men paint themselves. Buckley knows, holy crap, shit's going down. They come over and massacre the family in front of Buckley. And then the people who just finished killing his family are like, did you want to come with us? We'll take care of you. They show this kind of real interest in him. How do you think he dealt with seeing that happen?
He didn't deal with it. He couldn't deal with it because to them it was like, it's almost like, think of it, I try to think of it this way. It's like someone killing someone and saying, it's not personal, it's business. Yeah. They believed that they had to get rid of this evil sorcery. Buckley wasn't involved. It wasn't Buckley who had the sorcery. It was somebody else. So when they killed the family, they had got rid of something that was a problem for their tribe, that there was sorcery emanating from someone. And they didn't have any problem with Buckley himself. They didn't associate him with the death by a snake. So why can't he be a friend? So they don't see it as in any way. But of course, Buckley, these were his beloved family, closest relations amongst his Aboriginal family. And he wasn't, that's where his Europeanness was still evident. Whilst he might have understood what was going on in the culture, he couldn't always accept it. He couldn't act like that. He was a European, and he brought up for cause and effect, not for superstition. So I see it as a sort of the equivalent of a mafia shooting. And we didn't do it personally. We had to do it for business sake. There was nothing against you. We had to get rid of this person. That's how I think it was like. And he couldn't get his head around that. And then he went off into the wilderness and self-isolated, so to speak, and for many, many years, because he couldn't deal with various Aboriginals. Some of these Wadawurrung customs, he had trouble with them.
Oh, I can't imagine. Yeah, I can't imagine being in that position because you've felt like you've tried to leave that behind. You've joined this, Eden and then you're faced with this completely different culture that, you know, you just wouldn't be able to fathom. But so he was effectively a pariah, sort of self-isolated type like we are at the moment, but in the
Yes.
bush. And he heard eventually that the British men had come on land and that the Wadawurrung were going to kill them because they hadn't been sharing anything with them, right?
Exactly, yeah.
So
Sorry.
So that he ends up going back with them, right? I mean, and trying to maintain these relationships between Indigenous people and the settlers who established Melbourne. Can you talk about what that process was like and sort of where Buckley ends up living out the rest of his life?
Yeah, what happens is, I'll try to put it in a nutshell. Buckley, there was 8 men, and Buckley basically says to his Aboriginal friends, don't kill these people. Don't get rid of them, because there will be more boats with more booty and you will be recompensed for these people being here. And they believed him. And there was also the interesting thing here is that the local people fell in with the 5 Sydney, they call them Sydney blacks. That's what they were described as. They were the Aboriginal men that worked for John Batman. And they embedded themselves very, very intelligently with the local people and went corroborating and kangarooing, as they called it. And they got on. So there was a lot of good faith, but at the same time, there was underneath a simmering tension. You are not giving us enough, and we will come and get them. And Buckley had enough clout to stave this off, but he was hoping all the time that another boat would come, and the other boat would be filled with things and he was quite right. When it came, there was more bounty, and the Aborigines began to believe, oh, well, these white men aren't so bad after all. They're paying us off. We're looking at... Buckley stayed there for a little while. Whilst he was waiting, he met one of Batman's men. John held a wedge, and Wedge said, you work for us and help us and we'll get you a pardon. Because let's not forget, he was a convict still. I mean, he was still considered a convict. Whilst he was still in Geelong, on the Bellarine Peninsula, his pardon came through. So he was actually a free man. Then, not much later, he was told that there was a better area in the Melbourne area was better on the Yarra. We're all moving up there. And of course, Buckley wasn't all that crazy about going up there, but by now he'd basically become a white man again. So that was several months in, and fell in with them thinking, and I think that he thought, look, let's just follow this. I better stay with the white men. We want to make sure there's no problems with anybody else. I'll be able to help. I think I can do the right thing by everybody. I'll smooth over things. I think he thought that he would they wanted him to be an integral part. They wanted him to be a man that could help and talk and smooth over any difficulties and problems. And so, of course, they moved to Woiwurrung area and Boonwurrung. It's parts of Melbourne with Boonwurrung and parts of Woiwurrung. And so there were Boonwurrung and Woiwurrung people there, and they weren't his people. The Wadawurrung were his people. And so Buckley was actually out of his country by then. Although he understood and he knew a lot of their customs and he'd met them and he'd been with the Woiwurrung, that wasn't his country. So he was never really that happy in Woiwurrung territory. So he'd been moved. So he was slightly unsettled by that, although, he'd been there before. I think he probably knew the Melbourne. He had gone through the Melbourne area when he was escaping. How well he knew it until he settled there. And he worked for John Batman. He made a chimney, and it's arguable that he was actually put the very first. He made the very first stone in Melbourne, actually, funnily enough, on Batman's Hill. People say Buckley's chimney was the very first piece of masonry, so to speak. So yeah, he had a decent life there. We don't hear very much about what Batman thought of things, because by this time Batman was getting very sick, and Faulkner had come just before Batman. And Faulkner was becoming the big man in town, whereas Batman you hear very little of, and I think it's because you don't hear him giving speeches, you don't hear him, telling people what to do, but Faulkner's basically become the big man, and people were listening to Faulkner as their leader by in the early stages, not Batman. Although Batman had the prime position on the hill, he was still kind of the king of Melbourne at that point.
It seems like such a difficult position too that Buckley's in, because the stories seem to be all about truth and dishonesty and a shitload of grey, right? I think you write at one point that so much of this story is about lying, perhaps more accurately being two-faced to keep the peace. What did you mean by that?
Yeah, I think if you look at Buckley's situation, if just look at this situation where he's talking to the Aboriginal people saying, don't kill the white people. They're going to bring more booty. So he's being two-faced in the sense because he knows that the more white people come, the more ships come, the more people land, the more he's endangering the local inhabitants. Yet at the same time, he's trying to preserve the make sure that there are no deaths among the white people. And what this story kind of shows is you can't play devil's advocate the entire time. Now, another example is when Batman finally did arrive, he gave a speech, and Buckley had to be the one, of course, doing the interpretation. And basically, Batman says, if you shoot a man, we will shoot you like a kangaroo. So here is Buckley at one point trying to be the Aboriginals' agent, being the agent of the white people, being the one who delivers all these messages, saying, if you do this and don't do the right thing by us, we will kill you. So what are the Aborigines going to, and the Wadawurrung or the Woiwurrung or the Boonwurrung who are listening, what are they going to think of Buckley? Whose side are you on, buddy?
Yeah.
So, he had to play two sides to keep the peace, but it doesn't work that way. And that's what this story pretty much tells us, that you can't be two people all at the same time. And I think that in the end, Buckley had enough of trying. I mean, there was a story of him and Foster Fyans later on. And he's telling the people they have to do this and they have to do that. And Foster Fyans is asking him to translate. And I think he just basically got jack of it. Why am I telling these people? These are my people. I'm in Geelong territory. And I'm telling them not to do this and to do that. And I'm just being the white man's, voice. I'm not protecting them in any way. And he just said, I've had enough of this. The white man thinks that I'm half savage and doesn't trust me. And the black man, I'm the man delivering all these messages of doom to them. So you can't be the two things at the same time. And that's what I think his great dilemma was. And it started from the very first second when he had to lie to the Aboriginal people pretty much and said, don't kill them. These people will bring more stuff. He didn't know if they were going to bring. He thought they would. But he had to lie to them to keep them alive. So he's doing the right thing and making sure no one kills each other, but having to lie to do it at the same time. You can't be the two things at the same time. That's what this story is really about, I think. And
I imagine, too, if he just said, have at it, kill them all, it's like, well, you've, removed that problem for the next few months until the next group of people come more heavily armed.
He would have known. Also, let's not forget, there was something in it for him. He would have thought, if I do the right thing by white people, I'm going to get a pardon. So there was a tit for tat going on here. And that's what it kind of was said to him. They said, if you work for us and be our guide and helpful and show us around country and help us interpret and people understand our intentions, we'll give you a pardon. And of course, that's what he got. But he'd already played with the devil. Once he'd accepted the devil's offer, he was with the devil, and he didn't mean to be. He didn't want to be, but he had to be, unfortunately. That's the deal he had to do.
It seems to, like in the story, there are so many of these juxtapositions, right? With Buckley and the Wadawurrung, Buckley's land was taken from his parents, right, in the Enclosure Act in England during the Industrial Revolution. And this similar sort of situation is taking place, or an analogous situation, right, with the Indigenous people.
That's why I think he had to leave. He couldn't sit by and watch the people he loved having their lands taken away. He'd experienced it himself. In fact, you could argue that he was seeing his own lands being taken away by these ruthless white settlers. So he is the microcosm of many of the problems that were going on here. And he is that's why I love this story, because it's not just about white taking over black. It's about a man stuck in the middle of it all, trying to do the right thing by everybody and finding that he can do the right by none. And it's a story of paying the devil to be. Once you've taken that side, you're gone. And he said, I've had enough. I cannot be on a white policeman and watch my people being destroyed. And I think he had to leave. How could he have, if he'd stayed another 5 years in the Melbourne area, I think he would have committed suicide.
Yeah.
He would have seen a decimation of all the people around him. And the white people, of course, didn't understand that. They didn't understand that, at least emotionally, he was an Aborigine. He was emotionally an Aborigine watching his people being destroyed. He had more emotional ties with them than he did with any white people. Yet the white people were the people who would give him his freedom. And therein lies the problem. They gave him money and a possibility. The other people gave him the love. And so where does a man go in that situation? And that's why this is such an important story on an emotional level as well.
So finishing up, would you say that truth is better than fiction sometimes? Because, we've all just gotten off the roller coaster that was Game of Thrones, and we love that.
You've got me on one of my pet subjects here. I'm not a great lover of historical fiction, and I'm on the record with various literary. I think the world lives on historical fiction. The Hilary Mantel stuff. Where they pretend that they've been there. I don't use anything that hasn't been put on the record. My father as well, I had huge arguments with Bryce. He's an historical fiction guy. Mm-hmm. We never came to any understanding on this. He believed the imagination was more important. I believe the facts. So you could get me an hour on this one.
But I feel like that this story is so good because there are no real black and white. Here's the good guy. Here's the bad guy.
No good guy.
This is the story you work out who are the villains and who are the heroes.
The truth is always more interesting than fiction every single time. I remember someone saying, if you look at something hard enough, you'll find it's always interesting. Everything that you look at is interesting if you look at it hard enough. And that's why let's go full circle and say that's why I don't think Australian history has been looked at hard enough, because the really interesting stuff is the stuff we're not being taught. And I want to find stories like Buckley, like Jimmy Porter, that put the human into a historical and social context to make us understand what was going on at that particular time. But you can't do it just purely by, in my opinion, this is just my opinion, just by telling the story of Melbourne was started at this time and there was John Batman and they fell out with that. You've got to do it through a character, and only through a character, a real character, not a fake one, a real character. Too many people do it through fake ones, and I don't do that.
It's almost like junk food, right? It's too easy to consume. You want something that leaves you thinking and leaves you grappling with, what did I just read? Because, to finish up this book,
well, you read as best as possible. You read as best as possible the facts and the truth about two men, John Batman, and I'm hoping that that's as good as anything that any historical fiction writer will write. In fact, I think it's better because I just deal with what we know. I don't veer away from that, and that's it. And that's enough in there to tell you everything you need to know about. I would say that I wrote it, but I think there's enough in there, of course, for you to understand what these people were about.
Well, Adam Courtenay, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. I really appreciate it. And guys, get your hands on The Ghost and the Bounty Hunter, because it is a page turner for sure.
Thank you, mate. Pete, it's been a pleasure talking to you, and we'll do it again if I write another book. Just got to find another story like this one, as good as this. I'll find it somewhere.
Man, there's loads in Australian history. You've got ample to choose from, right?
Look, it's hard to find the right ones, but they've got to have a certain amount of criteria that tick a few boxes. But we'll find another one, and I'm sure we'll have another talk at some point.
No worries. Thanks again so much, mate. I appreciate it.
It's a pleasure, mate, and I hope you enjoyed it. Okay, mate. Bye-bye.
All right, guys, that's it for today. Thanks again, Adam Courtenay, for coming on the podcast. It was an absolute pleasure to have a natter with you, mate, to have a yarn with you. Guys, don't forget to pick up your copy of The Ghost and the Bounty Hunter. It's available now in all good bookstores, guys. Get it online if you're stuck inside because of the quarantine, and use this time to level up your English and learn a bit about Australian culture. Once again, guys, thank you so much for joining me. It's always a pleasure. I wish you all the best, and I'll see you soon. Peace.